Max, this book is the story of how you survived the Holocaust. It claimed the lives of virtually all your family. Why did you decide that you needed to share this story?
Well, I'm an educator. I've been educating Canadian students for 32 years. I've traveled this country from east to west, and I think I've spoken every province to elementary schools, high schools, universities, and so on. And I've been asked thousands of times, Mr. Eisen, did you put this down in a book form? And but I think in the back of my mind, there was this idea of fermenting that I need to put this down on a book for sure. And when I parted with my father in Auschwitz and my uncle in 1944, on July the 9th, 1944, they were selected for medical experiments, and we only had seconds to say goodbye. And my father gave me a blessing through the wires. They were in a quarantine area, and the guards were yelling at me that if I don't move, they'll shoot. My father gave me a blessing, and he told me that if I managed to survive, I have to tell the world what happened here. So I started to write this book at a very late stage in my life, in my 80s, and I tried all kinds of different ways to put my thoughts into a book, and finally I had to start to write it. And I wrote this book. Took me 3 years. I wrote it with pencil and paper. And I dictated my words to my wife, who put it on a computer, my son and granddaughter. So it was truly a labor of love for 3 years. And I'm so happy that I finally managed to finish it. And I phoned Jim Gifford at HarperCollins. I was going on a March of the Living for 2 weeks. And I said, look, I have my memoirs, and could I send it to you? I would like to know if it's worth anything. I knew very little about publishing books. And he said, well, look, I'll have to read it. I said, well, I'll come back 2 weeks later, I'll find out. So 2 days later, I received an email from HarperCollins that they would be honored to publish my memoirs. I was in shock, actually, and but I think I wrote it because that particular era from 1933 to 1945 was a time of such dehumanization and demonization of Jews and people with racial features who didn't fit in the Nazi mold, that I thought I need to put this down on paper for posterity. So, and here's the final product. So. Okay.
Ziya, what made you want to defend Max's book?
Well, I had a chance to read many different books before making my selection for Canada Reads, and this one stood out. There was no doubt in my mind after reading this book that this was going to be my choice. And it's also incredibly timely. Of course, Max, who's sitting right beside me, is living history, right? An ability to tie myself right back to the imagery, because his memory is better than mine. I can't remember what I had for breakfast 3 days ago. He can paint an image that almost makes you feel like you're watching a movie, where you can smell the smells and you can see what he's seeing and hear what he's hearing. And it was so vivid and so powerful. And as I look around now and I'm starting to see swastikas that are being painted on playgrounds, messages like kill all Jews and kill all Muslims that are on Canadian streets, and you're starting to see people running for mayor in this very city who are advocating and promoting books for the elimination of Jews. And I said, there is no better time than right now for us to all be reading Max's book.
I was also able to witness Max's incredible memory. I don't know if you want to share your diet with people. I'm just in awe of, you know, somebody, you'll say, you know, most people, they'll try to remember years and they'll get years mixed up. You know everything that happened. I don't know if, was it a difficult exercise for you to try to remember, or has it all been there because of the years of speaking about it?
Well, my wife tells me that I have a photographic memory, and I love books. In fact, my aunt, who was an invalid, she taught me the love of books. I was 5 years old, and I finished all the books by Jules Verne. And under the Hungarians, I was thrown out of school. We Jewish kids were thrown out of school. I was 12 and a half years old. So, and from there on, I went to the School of Hard Knocks, really. And so when I was liberated years later, I started to read books again, and I truly learned everything from books that I know. And even learning English, in Czechoslovakia, the 3 years after the war, I read all the classics by Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. I always went for the thickest books. So when I arrived in Canada, and it was 70 years ago, just last week, October the 27th, I went to the library in college, and I believe it was on St. George or McCall Street. There was a big library. And I read the same classics in English, so I figured out, I understood some of the words. So this is how, and I have to mention somebody else that was very important part of my publishing this book, a professor, Amanda Gibb from London, from Western University.
Yeah.
Who was that?
Who was that? Somebody in the back there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So she was with me and Jim Gifford. In 2010, we were on a mission to the Wiesenthal Center. It was called Compassion to Action. And she said that she would be honored to help me, and she did a lot of work, and she sort of kept my feet to the fire. And when we tried everything else, and she said, well, you'll have to sit down and write. And she said, send me a few chapters. And, you know, I had a difficult time to write. And then finally, when I had to sit down, I said, well, how am I going to do this? To me, it looked like a Gordian knot. I didn't know which string to pull first, and I thought, well, I'm going to watch this movie in my head, and I'm going to put it down on paper. So when she received those two chapters, she sent me back an email. She said, keep writing. And publishing a book is not an easy task. You send it to Amanda, and she makes corrections, and you go back and forth 100 times, and you look for mistakes and so on. So, finally it was published, and that was a wonderful moment. And it's a book for my family and for Canada. And I want you to know that students that are reading this book, I speak to students, and it's students that I want to teach of how hatred can kill, actually. I always tell them that bad things start with words, and it ends in terrible places. So these students are telling me or sending me emails, Mr. Eisen, never in my life will I complain about little things. And say, you saved my life. I'm going to be a better student. I tell them about goals in life. How did I survive? Well, I had so many work skills and life skills that my grandfather especially, but my entire family, gave me when I was a child. I was a terrible student. I was a doer. I wasn't a learner. And sadly, my younger brother, Eugene, who was absolutely a genius, and who knows what he would have been today, how he could have contributed to this world. And so those skills arriving in Auschwitz, I believe, as if they prepared a map for me to travel by. And I wouldn't have survived had my father and uncle not been with me for 2 months, because how do you get acclimatized coming from a home, even though it was a fascist country, Hungary, this was a totally different ballgame. So, and I say that you need to have work skills, life skills. My grandfather always hammered it into my head that no matter what I was going to do, I have to be the best at it. And I try to follow that rule.
Thank you, Max. I wanted to ask you one last question. What have you learned in the last, I guess, day and a half? It's been, I guess, 2 days by now that you've been spending time. What else have you been able to learn from Max?
Well,
to learn from Max, I would say that, you know, I'm really eagerly awaiting the moment when each one of you has a chance to read his book, because I think you're going to be so deeply moved and shocked, absolutely shocked by what you read. But I think the thing too is you come across two kinds of people in Max's book. You come across people who don't care, and they're the kinds of people who can look away. And you come across the people who are kind and the people who help. And that's a really uplifting thing to see. And that's the message that I hope we can all keep with us.
Ziya Tong and Max Eisen. Thank you. Yes, Max.
Could I just say one
Yes.
more thing? May I? So, and another reason this book is here is to sort of tell people how these things start and what happens when the Pandora's box is open and these terrible things are not nipped in the bud. This past July, I had a poster of my face beside a synagogue in Toronto, and it said that the Jewish Federation supports Holocaust education. I think it was July the 21st, I don't remember the date. Somebody called me that somebody painted a word on my forehead on this poster beside the Beth Jacob Synagogue, and it said, Achtung. And I was shocked. And it took the police about 4 days to declare this an act of hate. And I just wondered how many people would know what the word Achtung means. So it's a very benign word if people don't know the word. And I go to schools and I ask who knows what Achtung means, and nobody knew. So for me, the way I remember that word is in Auschwitz I, in 1944, when the selections were happening every night, the loudspeakers are turned on in the camp, and you have this reflex action. You fly right out of your bunk, and it says, Achtung, Achtung, inmates from barrack so-and-so and so immediately line up in front of the barrack for transport. So this poison has arrived here, and this is not a Jewish problem. This is a problem for the entire community, and everybody needs to stand up and say, you cannot do this, we will not allow you to do this in our schools, in our cities, in our country. So it left me in shock, and I had a lot of support from a lot of people. But it's here, and it needs to be looked into very seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, Ziya.
Thank you.